Welcome. I'm Richard Walker. I'm the Executive Director of the Living New Deal, and I'm a Professor Emeritus of Economic Geography at the University of California at Berkeley. Today's webinar, Energy, Entropy, and the New Deal, is a conversation with our distinguished guest and Living New Deal advisor, Dr. James Galbraith. In our conversation tonight, we will talk about the forces at work in the economy leading up to the Great Depression, how the New Deal responded, and how that impacted the rest of the 20th century. The Living New Deal, if you are not already familiar with us, began at the University of California in the early 2000s. We went independent in the 2010s and are now a national project. Our mission is to preserve the New Deal's legacy, to educate Americans as to what the New Deal did, and to promote the New Deal as a model for government today, something which the country can sorely use. Tonight, we welcome Dr. James Galbraith, Professor of Government at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. He has served as the Executive Director of the Congressional Joint Economic Committee and the House Banking Committee. He has been a Marshall Scholar, a Fulbright and Carnegie awardee, and many other awards. And he is a prolific author on economic issues. Recent books have covered inequality, the 2008 financial crisis, and the Great Recession. His latest book is the basis of tonight's discussion. It's called Entropy Economics, the Living Basis of Value and Production, and is co-authored with Jing Chen, and out from the University of Chicago Press. Jamie, it is a great pleasure to have you here tonight as our speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Dick. And let me reciprocate. The pleasure is very much mine. And I also would like to begin by just stating my very profound admiration for the work that the Living New Deal has been doing over the years, which has brought an enormous degree of recognition of the continuing legacy of this period. It's been I've been very proud to be a small part of this project, at least associated with it in an honorific way. It's truly a pleasure and a privilege.
Oh, well, thank you very much. So let's get going. Now, this book, Entropy Economics, starts off with a good deal of review of economic theory and stating your basic principles, most of which, almost all of which, I agree with. But I thought you might want to give us, the audience, just a brief introduction to what the heck entropy economics is before we launch into a discussion of actual economic history and how it involves the New Deal in the 20th century.
Well, I'll just say very simply, and I think this is something that anyone who has taken a basic course in economics knows, is that the textbook economics is profoundly detached from the real world. And the reason it's detached from the real world is that it is based on a set of ideas that have their origins really thousands of years, but certainly back in the 18th century, and that became basically incompatible with modern science by the middle of the 19th century. Ideas of equilibrium, the balance of supply and demand, the notion that markets will self-organize, that competition is perfect when it consists when the economy consists of lots of small firms who can't really influence each other very much. All of this is profoundly out of sync with the way economic history developed from the Industrial Revolution onward, but certainly by the time of the early 20th century, when we were heading into the Great Depression that eventually brought us the New Deal. And so what we tried to do was to frame in very straightforward and basically very simple ways a set of propositions that would enable someone coming to economics with an open mind to conceptualize how the economy works in a way which is compatible with the way it actually does work and the way it has worked, really since the beginning of serious levels of economic organization, at least we're really through all of time. So that's our objective, and I think it has particular relevance to the story of the Depression and the New Deal.
All right. Yes, I quite agree that most economics is off in the stratosphere, mathematical models, the beauty of markets, elegant mathematical descriptions that don't tell us really very much and haven't been very successful at predicting what goes on in the real economy. So your entropy economics is deeply rooted in production of value, and production itself is rooted in, of course, natural resources, something which most mainstream economics hardly talks about. Now, as an economic geographer, I, of course, love this, and I think it's profoundly true. And there's been quite a bit of good work in this domain in recent years, which we might come back to. But in your view here, it seems that the natural resources seem to boil down chiefly to energy, to the energy economy. Is that true?
Well, the energy economy is at the foundation of the use of natural resources, and so one can broadly trace, the role of wood and charcoal being supplanted by coal and coke in the efflorescence of the Industrial Revolution, which brought us the age of machinery and the age of steel and steam. And then that became largely displaced, overtaken by petroleum, by oil, and that was something that happened in the course of the early 20th century, but with an especially big effect as oil was discovered in large quantities in Texas in the early 1930s. So one can I think clearly show that the energy sources underpin the use of other resources. As obviously you need a lot of energy to take an ore out of the ground and transform it back into a usable metal, to do practically anything else with natural resources.
Yes, and actually the book itself, for those who are interested, has quite an interesting discussion in one chapter of economic history going back to the rise of civilizations, Iron Age, Bronze Age, and so on, and then talks briefly about the Industrial Revolution. And you have a very definite fuel-driven theory of the Industrial Revolution, which we might come back to, but I don't think so. But then you come to the 20th century, and I think it is true that petroleum, obviously the shift from coal to petroleum, is absolutely a signal of the rise of a different economic era in the 20th century. Many people have referred to it as the fossil fuel age or the age of petroleum and so on. And it has affected almost everything we do, how we move around, how we do agriculture, how we do industry, the way we live, our everyday products, and so on.
And the nature of transportation, especially. Before coming on, I was perusing this book of documentary history by William Lichtenberg, which I find very useful. And I just picked up the passages by A.A. Burrell on the theory of the New Deal. He says something which I find very sympathetic from the standpoint of our argument, which is that the New Deal conceived of the economy as fundamentally a problem of organization. And that it arrived at a moment when the organization of production had become extraordinarily efficient. And this was the true, characteristically of the early part of the 20th century through the 1920s, many new technical developments and a great explosion of industrial activity. But the machine was profoundly unbalanced. It produced a distribution of income that was radically unequal, so that a great many people who were engaged in production could not afford to buy the output that was being produced. It rendered a great many things basically uneconomic by undermining their previous basis, including animal-based agriculture and the horse-drawn plow, and which occupied a great deal of American land to supply forage for farm animals. All of this got undermined it was essentially extremely fragile by the end of the 1920s. And then the understanding that something radically new and much more efficient was coming along helped to deliver, I would say, kind of coup de grace to that era of industrialization. And that is what, since it takes adjustment would have occurred over time, maybe 20, 30 years, but the society could not withstand the strain. And that is what essentially made the New Deal into the necessity that Roosevelt saw for effecting a very rapid transformation of the way the American economy was structured and the way it worked.
Let's step back for a moment and
Yeah.
say fill out a little more of the picture of the early 20th century as that economic revolution took place. Now, most economic historians focus on the Fordist mass production revolution in automobiles, the production of many, many mechanical products. But I think it's very interesting to point out that not only did the gas internal combustion engine went out to drive those cars, but those cars depended on materials, a whole new set of hardened steels that you could make much more accurate tools with, much closer calibration. That was a real age of the replaceable part, the standardized part because of that. And then, of course, the lines themselves were driven by electricity. And the electrical revolution that had started right at the end of the 19th century accompanies the petroleum revolution and helps drive industry. And of course, electricity we'll see in the New Deal. Does that picture accord with your overall sense of the revolution, the kind of new industrial revolution of the early 20th century?
Yeah, laying the groundwork for a much larger expansion of the use of the new technologies that became possible once infrastructure was available. I mean, initially electricity was provided to cities because the electrical companies could not make a profit by providing them to the country as a whole, and certainly to the countryside. So farmers didn't have access to electricity, certainly not in the South, not in the Texas Hill Country. And that meant that this new technology was available substantially on an extractive basis. It was not doing what it could do to support the growth of the whole economy. And something I think roughly similar was true, although cars were certainly spreading rapidly in the 1920s. The infrastructure for an automobile culture was not in place. My father grew up in the early part of the 20th century and emigrated from Canada to the United States in 1930 by boat from Port Talbot, Ontario to Cleveland with another student, and they bought a Model T. And they drove it out to your stomping grounds, to the University of California at Berkeley, where he had a fellowship at Giannini Hall to study agricultural economics. And he notes in one of his memoirs that from Lincoln, Nebraska to the California line, they did not see a paved road. That was the situation in 1930. And so one can say, okay, there was an enormous potential for the integration of the country on a new technical basis, but that potential had not been realized until decisions were taken to realize it on a massive scale. And those decisions began to come in 1933, 34.
Well, but you would agree that the states were all passing gas taxes and starting to build new road systems. Certainly that was true here in California. And so the highway system was starting to really be built up. You started to get the first National Highway Acts to support the states in their efforts to build more roads. So that was happening pretty clearly after World War
Well, it
One.
may be that, yeah, I'm sure that's true in California. And as I say, once you got to the California line, the roads were paved, but before that they weren't. So the states had very different capacity to actually
Yeah.
act on that in the 1920s.
Yeah, it did. So the car culture was developing. The infrastructure was not really built out yet, you're saying. Gasoline, of course, was propelling the cars. And then there were the trucks. And I think an important part of your argument is going to be about trucks, because trucks were starting to be produced and tractors in large numbers in the interwar period before the New Deal that were going to be very
Trucks came in the First World
destabilizing.
War in the Army, and but again, they didn't have a lot of civilian uses. The first, I think, the first effort to drive a convoy of trucks across the country was in 1919, and it was led by I guess, a colonel at the time by the name of Dwight Eisenhower. Took a convoy and took him several months to cross the country in the trucks of that particular moment. So the real question of whether the trucks were a necessity or something that, well, the necessity for which was created by the changing conditions and by, of course, the marketing of the producers. But in any event, we're looking at a real transformation in the structure of the economy, and that is going to bring about massive dislocations. And of course, from the standpoint of the of the working population, there are two types of transformation. One was the displacement of people from the farms as the farms increasingly mechanized, and the other was the displacement of people from large-scale factories that were no longer viable once the crash happened, and once the depression took hold in the early 1930s.
Okay, so agricultural productivity goes up, and you're arguing that drives out a lot of farmers, and trucks are starting to appear, and that's going to have a big effect that you mentioned, which is the massive displacement of the railroads, which were the integument of the economy up until then, massively built all over the country, as highways were not yet. And they run into huge trouble and have a massive crisis and throw out, literally millions of workers get thrown out of the railroads with the coming of the Great Depression, right?
Yeah, well, I don't know about millions, but certainly many hundreds of thousands. Sure.
Hundreds of thousands.
And
Okay, we'll go with that.
yeah, you're seeing, and this is very clear to the architects of the New Deal, that they have what they started with was not a failure of the productive mechanisms of capitalism, but the consequence of what one might call an unregulated success. An unregulated success and a massive imbalance between what could be supplied, what could be sold, and between what the financial obligations that industries had acquired and what they could service with the profits or absence of profits they could make. And one of the things we do in the book is provide the simple mechanics of how that works when you have an enormous fixed overhead that you have to cover, which was true of the railroads, was true of the great factories. And you find that the underlying conditions change on you compared to what you expected them to be, and quickly your capital value collapses. And that's the essence, I think, of the problem that Roosevelt and his team faced, a problem that had to be dealt with at the start of the New Deal.
So usual treatments of the New Deal and of the Great Depression focus on the financial collapse and the financial reforms, which are very, very important, of course, to get the credit system working again, the banking system. So the New Deal did that. And the New Deal plays this very big role in stabilizing finance, regulation. Then the second thing people remember is, well, there was a lot of relief and relief work to help the unemployed, and then there was Social Security and so on. But really, the
That comes a little later, 1935, it gets underway.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah,
But we're talking about the
sure.
whole of the New Deal. The third element that we try to emphasize at the Living New Deal, and I think that you are emphasizing, is this massive reorientation of the economy through investment in highways, hydroelectric dams, and electricity distribution through the REA, through the Bureau of Reclamation, the Corps of Engineers, the PWA, and so on. It's a massive modernization of the economy that really extends the modern infrastructure and strengthens it for this new era of production. I think that's what you're saying.
Yes, and another thing I would add to that is that this also involves the revitalization of agriculture. The United States had been up, by that time, 300 years of soil depletion, and the agricultural basis of the Old South was always based upon expanding to new lands, which then would be run down by tobacco and cotton and other crops, which are, they were not practicing soil renewal. Became clear in the late 19th century that this is what you have to do, and it had begun. It was underway in much of the North by by the turn of the century, but not so much in the South. And the Tennessee Valley Authority and other New Deal institutions brought to a very deeply depleted and impoverished region the capacity to begin to renew the soils and put themselves on a sustainable basis. So you can put that in the mix. David Lilienthal, again in this book of documents, is talking about the great fertilizer plant that was built at Muscle Shoals, and that is a huge contribution to, let's say, the scientific management of the most precious resource, which is the American soil. And then one talks about, obviously we have the history of the Dust Bowl, which was again created by and large by the attack on rather thin and dust-prone soils by massive mechanization, and then the New Deal came at that problem with soil reclamation, with reforestation, which then helps to stabilize the entire environment. Same thing true by and large also in the Northeast, where Roosevelt was fully aware that much of the agriculture in upstate New York and New England was depleted and should be turned over to forests, which are still there today, to be economically useful, and to avoid the problem of essentially trying to support an agricultural sector that was no longer potentially productive.
Yes, and that's another thing we emphasize is that the conservation side of the New Deal was profound. It was a Green New Deal in its own time.
Over 1 billion trees were planted by the New Deal.
Oh, more than that.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's if
soil conservation, trees.
The truth is that
water.
The northeastern United States, those forests are essentially New Deal creations to a very large extent. And that's the whole area is covered with them now, which wasn't true 150 years ago.
Oh, that's right. Yes, and also, there was other waterworks, other elements of this, waterworks, and of course the dams, which are both seen as conservation as well as electric generation.
One thing it's curious about this discussion, just to bring into the work of the Living New Deal, is I look at your wonderful maps and your websites, and they give us, particularly people who live in cities, or just an extraordinary sense of how much our urban environment has been influenced by New Deal architecture, by the construction of courthouses and schools and airfields, and by the art of the New Deal. All of that's very clear, but it's I think a little harder to show how the New Deal transformed the productive structure of the economy, because so much of that is covered over by later events, or is simply part of the background landscape of the modern United States, and one needs to be aware that it wasn't just schools and courthouses, but a reconfiguration of how the whole productive structure of the country worked. This was when my father, when he left Berkeley in 1934 and passed through Washington, was immediately hired by the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. That was his first job in the U.S. government, and that again, going around rural America, you may not realize you're looking at the New Deal, but you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is why we now have a Rural America project to try to speak to rural Americans in the 21st century about what the New Deal did and what has not been done for them in many decades by both Democrats and Republicans in Washington. So resources really figure very greatly in the New Deal's program, and this modernization, this restoration of the land are all part of that transition that you're talking about that helped trigger the Great Depression. And also then the answer to it, the solutions provided by the New Deal, help pave the way for post-war recovery. I do want to throw in one point that a lot of people don't realize. They say, well, the New Deal didn't bring economic recovery, but it did. By 1939, 1940, the economy was back to where it had been in 1929, with the one exception of unemployment rates, which are still quite high, about 10%. But the problem was that the old factories and the railroads and the parts of the old industry that had been driven out of business by the Fordist Revolution and the petroleum revolution, electrical revolution, had laid off so many workers that it took a long time to absorb them. And of course, World War II did that. But what World War II did not do, and I think this is a very important fact, is it did not give a big boost to productivity. That had happened in the 20s and 30s. The data is very clear on that. There's a book by Fields about this, that the economic productivity had risen faster in the 20s and in the 30s than any other time in the last century and a half. And World War II
That was well understood
the
at the start of the New Deal, that they were dealing with the consequence of a vast rise in productivity. But I want to be a little bit careful about these unemployment numbers, as many people have heard the story and take it for sort of established history that the New Deal didn't really solve the Depression, that the Depression went on till 1939. It was only the war that brought it to an end. That has been a conventional view. But it's based upon some rather questionable statistical practices of the post-war period, which then went back and calculated what unemployment rates supposedly were. And one practice of that time was that they didn't count people who were working for the New Deal as really employed. So if you were digging the Lincoln Tunnel or building the Triborough Bridge or the air terminal at LaGuardia or whatever it was, that was not a real job because it was a job working for a New Deal agency rather than in the private sector. And that is a conceit of post-war economists to downplay the accomplishments. In fact, if you add in those jobs and say were real jobs, people were working and getting paid and building things of lasting value in most cases. And if not building things of lasting value, at least they were working in a way that was productive from their point of view. Then the unemployment rates in the middle 1930s are substantially lower. And there was a recession, of course, as we know, in 1937. It was an effort to balance the budget, so it wasn't uniform progress all the way. But by 1936, there had been a very, very substantial recovery. People at the time treated the Great Depression as being a phenomenon of 1930 to 33. And of course, the outcome of the 36 election, Roosevelt won all the states except for Vermont and Maine, uh, where it was a sign that the country understood that they had had 4 extraordinary years of recovery from the worst of what they'd been experiencing.
Well, the growth rates from 34 through 40, even before the war, for the next, 8 years, were up in the high single digits. They were like China in
That's
the
right. 33 to
21st century.
36 were the highest in peacetime. That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, again, we didn't have the benefit at the time of having national income statistics that were
No,
fully
they weren't
developed.
very good.
But that's what we now understand based upon what
That's right.
we've seen. So that's important to realize. But coming back to the sort of the physical underpinnings of this,
Yes.
I think the thing that ties it into to our book is an understanding that the New Deal took advantage of an extraordinary opportunity. And the opportunity was, first of all, the emergence very quickly of vast new, very efficient, very powerful energy resources. Again, oil, but also, as you pointed out, electrical capacity, hydroelectric capacity, which had not been developed or was in the process of being partly developed, but could not be completed successfully by the private sector, which I think was the case of the Hoover Dam, and I know was the case of the Mansfield Dam just outside of Austin, where I am now. It was started in the 1920s, but wasn't completed until the New Deal took it up, and that provided hydropower for the Texas Hill Country. So you're looking at an energy underpinning and essentially tapping into a vast low entropy resource base, which had previously been idle, had never been tapped. And that is what made it essentially viable for the New Deal to go ahead and transform the infrastructure and the productive base of the country. And then, of course, coming along in the 1940s, you have nuclear power, which is another crash program that essentially builds on the New Deal. You could not have had the Manhattan Project or atomic electricity if you did not have prior to that the Tennessee Valley Authority, which provided the electrical power for a large part of that operation. All of these things are based upon an understanding that there is an energetic foundation which not only needed to be developed, but in the case of soils, needed to be redeveloped and made soils which were depleted could be made productive again.
Well, and the war effort too. You think of all the bombers, the airplanes that were built with aluminum that could be mass produced because of the Bonneville project, and the TVA could be turned out because that was done by electrolysis. So now I thought we would pivot, because you do have things to say about the post-war economy and the sort of importance of this long-term fixed investment that the New Deal made, that underpinned a lot of the long period of prosperity after World War II.
Well, at the end of the war, the infrastructure that the New Deal had created was there and could be the foundation of what became the post-war economy. And one can have mixed feelings about suburbanization and the interstate highway system and the kind of transport network that the country developed. I have mixed feelings about it, but the fact is that it was the basis of American economic preeminence for maybe 30 years after the war. Now, 30 years is a well-chosen time, because that brings us to 1974, 1975, when you begin to see the limits of this model. And that is because the conventional oil production in the United States peaked at the lower 48 in 1970. We began to import increasing share of our petroleum needs, and in 1974 we were hit with a very substantial increase in the price, which again happened in 1979. And from that point forward, things become much more difficult. And we're looking at a prolonged period when we don't really have the same level of, let's say, leeway in the energy foundations of the economy that we had in the previous period. Again, made large investments. They worked very well for a while, but when the circumstances changed, they stopped working quite so well. And the measured productivity falls, and a great deal of American industry runs into difficulties. And that then is compounded by the way policy was conducted in the late 70s and 1980s. And you get the massive deindustrialization, which has been the characteristic of the last 40 years. And now we're sort of struggling with how to deal with that. There was some relief from natural gas, very substantial, probably ongoing relief from the rise of natural gas as yet another and even more efficient and substantially cleaner fuel even than oil, but not useful for all the same purposes. So you're looking at another set of issues. And of course, the climate question and the drive for renewable energy is part of the way people are struggling with attempting to deal with this question. But I would argue that we have not yet built the kind of coherent framework for treating these questions that our predecessors in the 1930s had. Well, maybe we don't have really the technical means to do so, but this is the problem that we face.
Well, this model does rest on an idea that cheap resources, available resources at low prices, principally fuels, are absolutely critical to economic growth. And I would argue that there's a lot of good work that for a much longer time, the 500 years of modern world capitalism, the production of cheap resources through conquest, extraction, stealing people's land, and very rude sorts of extractive means where they leave huge waste piles and kind of moving from one place to another was very characteristic of capitalism and also of American development for a very long time. And that meant that, the forest, you cut the forests in New England, then you cut the forests in Michigan, then you started cutting the forests in the Northwest and so on. And the New Deal tried to deal with that problem of healing the country, much to its credit. But then, of course, it helped launch on this petroleum-driven path and did things like build giant dams, which, as you said, have been questioned in retrospect, because what they are is a way of extracting cheap electricity from nature without an adequate, balance sheet to see what we're really doing.
Yeah, that's essentially.
But I don't think we can blame the New Deal for that.
That's the dilemma that we face now.
Yeah, it's not
as much as we admire the New Deal for what it did, we have to recognize that it had favorable conditions, and we have not recreated them. If we had some source of a substantially unlimited or certainly very expensive and readily available energy that we could harvest, then things would be much easier. So far, I'm still quite skeptical about harvesting the sunlight that comes down in unlimited quantities because it's extremely difficult to do that in a way which is fully efficient. You have to collect it over vast surfaces rather than simply drilling it out of the earth, and that's just substantially extremely hard to do and may not ever be able to be achieved successfully. We have to deal with the realities as they are.
Well, of course, nobody ever talks about actually being much more conserving in the way we use all these fuels and doing a much more efficient job. Both the producers and the consumers and the transportation infrastructure could all be so much more efficient. And there was some effort to do that through, say, electric cars, where you produce at one place instead of producing these little motors everywhere, which is a pretty inefficient way to go about it.
Well, we are seeing, if you look at what is happening in China, you are seeing a major transformation to electric cars. But there's a reason why that's important to the Chinese, and that is that they don't produce much of their own oil. Now, they import oil, and so it's a vulnerable source of supply for them in the way which it is not, at least at the moment, for us. And as a result, they have put a lot of emphasis in developing, with some success, a production infrastructure for electric cars. But then you're talking about powering those cars effectively with coal, because that's what's used to produce the electricity that goes into the batteries that power the cars. So it's not a completely straightforward answer,
No.
certainly to the problem of climate change, although it may be a straightforward answer to the problem of insecurity of energy supplies.
Well, but you do put a lot of weight on the idea of fossil fuels reaching a sort of natural limit, and I'm less convinced of that than you are, though I'm maybe just as convinced about, of course, the climate change impact of burning more fossil fuels. And it seems like the present elites in America and the present administration are living in a fantasy world in which that kind of cheap fossil fuel is just can go on forever. And it's not just that the climate implications of that, which they're blind to, but also the naivete of thinking that that golden age of cheap petroleum is something you can recreate just through willpower and fantasy.
Well, or another way of putting it is that one could interpret the energy policy of this administration as being one of taking advantage for the short period that they expect to be around of the resources that are there now and that are available now. And yeah, I don't uh, completely rule out the possibility that we could have a period when fuel prices are kept quite low. I think that's entirely possible. Whether that is the soundest strategy for the long run is, of course, a different question. And then one has to ask, were we doing it the right way in the previous administration? And there one has also a problem of, let's say, too much enthusiasm in the other direction. A great many of the, let's say, wind projects, offshore wind projects in particular, very high fixed costs, very difficult to maintain under the ocean conditions of salt water and ocean weather, and vulnerable to, in particular, to the rise in interest rates that happened beginning in 2022, which made the financial calculations for many of those projects go south, and has caused a certain number of them to be canceled. So there's a real question of the viability of the let's say the previous administration's view of how the climate question could be dealt with.
Okay. Well, Jamie, we usually allow about 15 minutes at the end of the hour for questions. So I want our audience to put on their thinking caps, send in your questions through the chat, and I will get to them in a moment. I think I'll give you one last challenge, though. I thought this is a very productive theory, in double sense, that's based on kind of hard reasoning about production, resources, energy, and so on. I thought it underplayed issues like the rise of global competition and the crisis of the 1970s, the the deregulation of finance, and with inequality, you've got all this loose capital flowing around, getting into trouble, creating new ways to try to make money out of nothing, which helped bring on the 2008 financial crisis.
No,
And
that's definitely
shortages.
part of the argument of the book, for sure.
Okay,
That
but
what happened here was that you had an underlying crisis of profitability, which brings on pressure to go easy for the regulators to go easy, particularly in the financial sector, and causes waves of enthusiasm when some entity, whether it's an Enron or Tyco or other, ultimately the big banks, find some way to appear to be doing much better than they are in fact doing. And so one can expect fraudulent activity to mushroom under those circumstances, and it does. And ultimately, of course, that will lead you to a crisis. The same thing was true toward the end of the 1920s. So it certainly played an important role in the crash of '29.
All right. Well, I think we'll do a shift in the mode of production here towards questioning, and we have several questions have come in, which I am going to go down through, probably one by one here. Here's one from Michigan. Fordson tractor was revolutionary. Also in my region, Michigan, sugar beets were developed as a native source of sugar, starting in the teens. Arguments for sugar beet cultivation involve soil science too. Are there other examples of new crops developed for industry? I guess at that time, the questioner means at that time.
Good question, to which I don't have the expertise to offer you an answer. I have to say I was involved in the debates over sugar in the mid 1970s when the sugar quotas were actually abolished for a short period of time. The sugar beets by that time had become a very high cost alternative to the tropical sugar, which was being held out of the country by quotas. Anyway, it's a sidelight, but something that I happened to be involved in when I was first on Capitol Hill at the age of about 22 or 23.
Well, I would add to that. I think that in the history of American agriculture and the problems of overproduction, we can be too focused on the tractor. A lot of the histories are, and scientific development of crops and cropping systems is a really important part of it, going all the way back to horticultural innovation in the 19th century, which was already driving smaller, weaker farmers out of business. In the 20th, a good example, you were talking about soils in the South, and of course, cotton, new forms of
The other thing
being
I'd just
developed.
add on that, just from my
Yeah.
family experience, my father grew up on a farm not far from Michigan in southern Ontario, 100 miles or so from Detroit. And he wrote actually as a teenager quite a number of columns for the local paper about agricultural practices. And what emerges from reading those is the extent to which the government agent and the farm cooperative were at the forefront of progressive change in this period. These were people who were prepared to let's say, to move forward on with technical developments. They were anxious to get tuberculosis out of their cows, to get better paint on their barns, this kind of thing, all of which was being fostered by a climate of let's say, of the progress of scientific knowledge and technological expertise in agriculture. And what the New Deal did, a decade or so later, was to begin to bring some of the same capacity to the much more stressed and much poorer agricultural regions of the American South. And that was, these were farmers who were by nature very, very conservative because they had they were operating on the thin margin of survival, and they couldn't afford to take risks unless they really got some assurance and some support and some ability to adopt better techniques, and then they were willing to do it. But this was the crucial problem that, among other things, the Tennessee Valley Authority was involved in trying to overcome.
Most of the questions I have here are about contemporary situation, but there are a couple going back to the New Deal itself. So I do want to pose those first, I think. One says, I think this you can definitely answer simply. Did the New Deal get anything significantly wrong? Did it miss anything of importance? Did it do any real damage to the country, or was it all good, all right, all timely, and all necessary?
Well, that's a
I think we have a
question
somewhat cynical view.
with the strong ideological overtones to it. There were people who felt that the New Deal was destroying the future of the American economy, American capitalism. The very distinguished and very conservative Harvard economist Joseph Schumpeter felt that way, and what he felt was that the rise of a massive national bureaucracy was just antithetical to the kind of, let's say, dynamic entrepreneurialism and ability to obtain massive fortunes with a gold strike in new technologies. Essentially, that Schumpeter thought was or identified, and not wrongly in many ways, as the driving force of a capitalist progress. So that, I think, is the main counter argument. That I don't particularly buy that argument, but I would identify as the predominant sort of counter trend. There were, of course, ebbs and flows in the New Deal. I don't know that they anticipated that in balancing the budget in 1937 would throw a lot of people out of work and cause a recession, but it did, and that opened the door for, in some sense, the rise to acceptance of the larger macroeconomic theories of John Maynard Keynes, which we haven't talked about at all because they weren't really all that significant in the first part of the New Deal. But after the budget balancing, the recession of '37, and then the push to full employment of the war, Keynes emerged as an interpreter of that sequence of events.
Right. Okay, there are, some very good questions here. One question is about the dismantle of the current situation. By the way, I guess a PS on that is that we did acknowledge, you definitely did, and I piggybacked on that, from a modern perspective, many of the some of the policies which were very accepted at the time and very supported by science of the time and progressive thought of the time, like over damming rivers, were not in the long run, would be coming for much more criticism, nuclear power. So it wasn't like it was all
Sure.
a bed of roses, and the long-term impacts of some of that was not good. But I think the point we're making is that for the economic problem of the time, it by and large did a great deal of good. Now, here's a question about the dismantling of the NLRB, that is labor rights. And does that have anything to do with the problem with the country's economy today?
I do think so. I think we are moving into a period in which we have a 1920s level concentration of capital values. We have lots of things that the 1920s didn't have to offset that. We have Social Security, we have Medicare, we have Medicaid, we have a much more robust system of veterans benefits and we have a much more robust system of fiscal federalism. But we are, again, in a period where the private economy has moved enormous amounts of valuation into a tiny handful of the most advanced, supposedly technologically advanced firms. And that's a very fragile, potentially very fragile and unstable situation. If we now undercut the living standards of working people, undercut their ability to organize where organization, unionization is feasible, undercut the minimum wage, undercut social benefits, undercut the public schools and all of the institutions that have created and what is still a by comparison with the 19th and early 20th century, but still a middle class, a very substantial middle class. Then we're going to be looking into the teeth of the late 1920s. And that's where I see the attack just the last few days on the NLRB is carried out by in the name of a small group of oligarchs who don't want unions at Amazon, who don't want unions at Tesla or other companies that they happen to own.
Yeah, yeah. The new capitalists are pretty much like the old bosses. There are two questions here that I'm going to combine in one because I think they're very close. One is about, does climate change offer a transition to new fields of employment? Is that an opportunity for economic growth? And the major New Deal focus was on environmental restoration, forestry, soils, wildlife, and so on. Do you see environmental restoration as a way to support future environmental and economic health?
Well, I think the problem is substantially greater than the one faced by the New Deal, the depletion of American soils, because this is the depletion of the atmosphere of the entire world. And it's also the case that the emissions that have already occurred, so far as we understand, will be fueling climate change far into the future, even if we somehow manage to bring emissions under control, a problem on which we've made essentially so far very little progress. We've converted some of our fuel supplies, but fundamentally, at the global scale, carbon emissions continue to go up. So I can't say that I have an enormous amount of confidence that this problem has has even technical solutions beyond trying to mitigate the consequences as time goes by. We see the rise of a certain amount of renewable power sources, but then at the same time, vast increases in the demand for electricity for data centers and artificial intelligence. And so at the end of the day, are we moving to a world in which we're supporting our living standards with a substantially lower emission of carbon in the atmosphere? I look at this with a cold eye and I say, I'm not optimistic that we've done what we might have wanted to do in that area.
But I would think you would say that to the extent that we know of certain things we should be doing, a massive kind of federal initiatives along the lines of the New Deal, whether it's a new CCC or it's physical investment in infrastructure, enlightened application of new technologies, all of that, a kind of new modernization for the 21st century, with environmental care being a part of that, soil care, so on. Seems to me
I would like
you
to
would
see
want to
that.
have that.
I would
You
like to see
couldn't do
that,
this
but I
without.
have the problem that I think we've gotten a bit far out over our skis with claims that the technologies we have can do things at low environmental cost that they may not be able to do, and where the environmental cost, for example, from putting windmills on the top of ridge lines around the country and so forth, is much larger than it's been admitted to. So this is a problem where we may have lost over the last decades the kind of independent technical capacity to judge what we should be doing. That should be vested in the government. And that is something which would have to be rebuilt if we're going to take a technical problem like this seriously and solve it, if it has a solution. That's the problem since the Reagan period. The government, and especially since the turn of the 21st century, the government has been stripped of its independent capacity. And you can't have this kind of program essentially run by the industries who are simply perhaps main interest is tax benefits or government subsidies rather than actually solving the problem. So I think we have to be realistic about that.
Well, that's a bit of a negative note, but overall, I thought it was a wonderful discussion. Thank you very much, Jamie. I think it puts
Thank
in
you. Once again, let me just say in closing that strength to your arms. What you're doing is of immense value to our understanding of who we are, what our history has been, and how the serious problems that we face might be solved. So thank you.
Well, on the back of that, I'll piggyback that please, members of the audience, come visit our website, livingnewdeal.org, that documents so many thousands of New Deal sites across the country and is a tremendous resource for educators, historians, preservations, and the public who want to learn about American history and about the vision of the New Deal in another very difficult time that could inspire us today. If you haven't as yet, please sign up to receive our newsletter, The Fireside, where you'll find articles by leading writers and thinkers about the New Deal and its relevance today. And you'll also learn about our in-person events. We do many of those, talks, lectures, tours, exhibits, and conferences, and more for online programs like this one. We have a long series of webinars to come, and the next one's on March 25th, and I hope you will tune in to be with us then. So good night for your participation. Thank you for your participation and for supporting the Living New Deal. Goodbye.